أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم برضوان إلى يوم الدين. So today, day 14, and I'm going to primarily focus on Surah Yusuf, which occurs in Juz 13 mostly. And so this, I think I will only have time to focus on this one surah today. The Prophet Yusuf is only mentioned in two surahs, a total of 27 times. And out of 27 times, only once mentioned outside of Surah Yusuf, which is the whole surah dedicated to his story, which is a one verse in Surah Naam, where he's mentioned as being from among the progeny or Zurriya of Ibrahim. And so beyond that recognition of him being included in Ibrahim a.s. Zurriya, Prophet Yusuf, unlike other messengers who are repeatedly mentioned in different surahs, Prophet Yusuf salam is only mentioned in this one surah in Quran, and which in this one surah, and this is where the whole surah is devoted to Prophet Yusuf salam. It's a very comprehensive surah, a lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of ways in which one can reflect on it, one can interpret it. And so I will only have, the amount of time I have, I will only be able to pick up few threads of the thoughts that I think are important to understand when we read this surah. This is also the surah which is considered a Meccan surah, that it was revealed in Mecca about the same time period as the Surah Yunus and Surah Hud. So these three surahs in continuation are from about the same time period of Prophet ﷺ's life in Mecca. Now, period of revelation is only important to the extent that it helps us understand the context of its revelation, but it has no other significance. It doesn't apply to a particular period of history or period of time, or is not, but an occasion that triggered its revelation helps us understand the context, the environment in which it was revealed. Beyond that, there is absolutely no benefit, and there is absolutely no reason to connect Quran historically to its time. Quran is a universal book, an eternal book for all times to come, and it is supposed to be read as that. So we cannot read Quran or any portion of the Quran as belonging to a particular period. But understanding or some knowledge about the period of its revelation, because we understand the Prophet's life and the stages through which he went through in his life, it helps us to put a context into what is the context in which this surah was revealed. And that helps us in understanding and deriving meaning from the verses, and it helps us to understand verses much better than if we didn't reflect on it, or if that information was not available to us. And so, as I had mentioned before in Surah Yunus and Surah Hud, this was a time period in Prophet's life in Mecca in which there was a serious opposition, active opposition, and persecution was going on in the society. And in that environment, this surah came down, which describes another prophet from another time. Another prophet from another time that went through stages of difficulties and hardships and trials from his very young age of boyhood. And then slowly through the events of time, so years are spent in even in prison. Finally, he comes out triumphant at the end. And so this is a message, first of all, is a message of hope for Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that Allah Subhanahu Wa Ta'ala takes people and certainly his messengers through all these different trials and all these different difficulties from which they arrive at a place which Allah has promised them. And so we start with the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, and we need to understand the context in terms of the space and location of the world that this story applies to. When Ibrahim alayhi salam migrated from his original home, which was in the closer to where the Iraq is, and that is where his father used to rule, and that's where his birthplace was. He migrated, and it is usually understood that it was under the command of Allah that Allah told him to go and inhabit in this area of what in today is known as Palestine, in which he asked him to make his home and inhabit that place. And that place is considered a place in which so many human struggles took place. But as Ibrahim alayhi salam is the one who laid the foundation of that area being inhabited. And it was his tribe and his family that was the originators of that place. And so he was living in almost a Bedouin type lifestyle, not very developed area, an undeveloped area in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent him. And some distance from that area was the Egyptian civilization. The Egyptian civilization was a leading civilization of the time, with all the entrapments and sophistications and advancements that a leading civilizations always carry. I mean, you may think technology, I don't even talk about technology being advanced. I say technology is different. The technology at that time was different, but people, in terms of their enjoyment, in terms of their technologies through which they brought ease to their life and comforts to their life and luxuries to their life, that sense of luxury and comfort and facilitation of life through technology was still part of all great civilizations of the world as it is today. And so that was the kind of place in which Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam came into being and grew up as a boy in that almost a Bedouin lifestyle. But he was a free man, free boy, a son of a prophet, and himself made prophet later on, although Quran does not describe the specific incidents in which he received the first revelation or started the communication, but he was the prophet, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes him as his prophet. So this is a free boy, noble character. Somehow through these circumstances ends up in Egypt as a slave. And ends up in Egypt as a slave in the household of the top official of the country, of the place, a powerful place. And with all the trappings of an upper class society, with freedoms and liberations and desires and luxuries and giving to your pleasures and all of that, being part of the culture of that upper class society, as you find is the case with the upper class in most societies in the world that don't conform to to any particular values. But he was a person of the utmost manners, noble character, and also what is apparent from the Quran's description was contained physical beauty that was unparalleled, that made people look up to him. Not only his inner beauty of character and steadfastness, but also his outer beauty of his appearance was such that it would attract people, it would impress people. And so this person finds himself uh, uh, in that household of the upper class Egyptian society, the most advanced civilization compared to the part of the world where he came from. And he's not native in that society, he's not used to those means and those surroundings that he found himself in. So the Surah Yusuf contains so many lessons about Prophet, his character, his way of dealing with people, his psychology, and everything else. But for some reason, one story stands out in all the narrations about the Prophet Yusuf whenever people think about him or whenever people talk about him. And that was his interaction with the wife of his master who fell for him and tried to seduce him and tried to invite him. And so that story carries the most weight in many thinkings and many narrations of Prophet Yusuf al-Islam, because obviously those kind of stories are the ones that our even modern society, the fiction and stories and films and everything revolves around it. And somehow the Muslims and others who read these surahs also tend to read this portion with more interest than the other portions of his story that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala contains in the surah, although that is a story that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in some detail. And the purpose for the description of that story is to convey to us the utmost high character that he possessed, that even in a society that would approve of that behavior, in which there was nothing wrong to pursue your pleasures and your luxuries, where it would not have been considered wrong or even a scandal as Quran indicates to it. Quran shows his utmost steadfastness throughout, never taking a wrong step. A person who was God-fearing, who is constantly referring to his relationship with Allah, constantly asking for Allah's help regarding this. And some of the other fictional accounts that are prevalent in the society regarding that story, I think we should not pay any attention to them. Because one of the primary concepts about the prophets that the Islamic thinking contains, which the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala absolutely establishes, which is known as Ismatul Anbiya. Ismatul Anbiya is a concept in which we hold Anbiya to be faultless in their personal character, to be faultless in their ways of dealing with the society, with the world, with themselves, that they will not do anything wrong because they were protected by Allah. Because someone who is going to be conveying a message on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, someone whose heart has to be prepared, whose mind has to be prepared to be able to receive a revelation which is such an extraordinary event that when Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam described the times when he would receive the revelation as the hardest on him physically, hardest, his body was unable to bear the burden. Not only that, it is described that he will be riding a camel and the revelation will come to him. And the camel will just sit down because it won't be able to bear the burden of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He will become so heavy as a result of receiving that revelation. So for a human being to be able to receive that revelation, then they need to acquire qualities that are superhuman in terms of their spirituality and their inner character. And that is why Ismatul Anbiya is such an important concept in Islam. Unlike some of the remnants of previous books that are attributed to revelations, Quran contains absolutely no scandal about any prophet. Quran doesn't point to anything about any prophet which would indicate a lowliness of their character or even a momentary lapse of a moral kind. And so Quran holds the prophets morally perfect. And so you cannot attribute base desires, animalistic instincts to them, because they had perfected their malakutiya, their spiritual existence, their spiritual character to the level where they are able to receive revelation from Allah. So, to think about the prophets like we think about ourselves, or what goes through our minds, and the way we deal with our temptations is wrong. The prophets were much higher beings, although they were human, but they were much higher beings of much higher spirituality, and they cannot be ascribed to that kind of behavior. And so Quran presents that. And one thing that stands out in the story of the Prophet Yusuf al-Islam from the first to the end is this shining character throughout that Quran conveys to us. And a lot of times people talk, if you read a class on writing and you're writing fiction, they talk about developing a character in the story, the character of your story, and you develop that character around it. I think, the Quran does it so beautifully to develop the character of that very noble person whom Allah had chosen, whom Allah had included among his chosen. And so he goes through all these different stages of life. His interaction with his brothers, his time in the house of his master, his going through the prison, and his dealing with the state, and him becoming assigned a responsibility in the state, one of the biggest responsibilities politically and socially. And throughout, what appears is his connection with Allah and his integrity. And I think if there's one lesson we want to draw from all of this story, is this integrity of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam that shines through the whole of the surah. And so with that, I just want to pick up few aspects of these stories. The first thing Quran narrates about him is his interaction with his brothers. And he had 11 brothers, I think, if I remember right. And those brothers, because of his, he was among all his brothers in the progeny of Yaqub alayhi salam, he was chosen to be the messenger. And anyone who's chosen to be messenger goes through special care from Allah in terms of their development, in terms of the strength of their mind and their spirit and their character and everything that shows through from the day they are born. And so obviously he carried a distinction among his brothers. And because of that distinction, and because Prophet Yaqub, his father, was a prophet, recognized that quality in him, his brothers carried a grudge in terms of that he is being favored by his father. Just a simple grudge that their younger brother is favored by their father more than themselves. That was all. Very simplistic grudge that is very normal human event that can arise under very normal circumstances. But what Quran describes is that the evilness or the wrongness of carrying a grudge. That if you carry a grudge, and his brothers were not evil persons. His brothers were not wrongdoers, evil persons, of bad character or bad morals or anything. After all, they grew up and trained in the household of a prophet. And Quran doesn't give any indication of them. And they were true to their words and their promises. And even later on at the time of famine, when they were in Egypt and they gave a word to their father, I mean, they were really worried at the circumstances they were facing and what answer they are going to give to their father in terms of keeping their word and their promise. And they regretted that at the time of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, they deceived their father at that time, and he understood that they didn't keep their promise to him, which was to protect him, and instead it pushed that grudge, pushed him to do a very ghastly crime, a very wrong thing to get rid of their brother. I mean, they just wanted to get rid of him, just go away from it, so that they felt that if he goes away, then everyone will be equal and things will be normalized. And so Quran narrates that story beautifully, realistically, faithfully, and gives us an insight into human psychology and the base, and contrast a base animalistic instinct to which a person can fall into, and the higher instincts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us to accept and implement in our lives. And so this is again a very important lesson that we draw from the story of his brothers. The second incident is, of course, the one in which he had to interact with the wife of his master, who tried to seduce him. But what I want to comment on in that whole story is the culture of their upper society, and the openness of that upper society, and the indecency of that upper society that eventually comes in through wealth and luxury and materialistic culture and enjoyment of life, and how it throws human being into becoming like animals, just blinded by their desires, and leaving limits of decency when they are driven by those desires. That not only did she did that, later on when the members of her society, of her status, or of her equal status, objected and laughed at her, why would she just go after her servant? She invited them all and brought Yusuf alayhi salam before them and said, look at him. And then she said, do you think I'm wrong to do that? And so this indicates the baseness and the lowness of the character of those women, and where the society would take them in that upper class, ruling class of the society in which it came about, and it became that. And Prophet Yusuf was protected from the very beginning. I mean, there was not like a point where he was about to give in. I mean, there was no such incident that Quran describes. Quran says, وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا, but it excludes that لَوْلَا أَنْ رَأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّي, that any human beings who is unable to see that would have fallen into it, but he is the one who saw the sign from Allah, a clear indication from Allah, who was connected with Allah, and who didn't get into that. كَذَلِكَ لِنَصْرِفَ عَنْهُ السُّوءَ وَالْفَحْشَاءَ, Allah protected him from even any hint of fahash or su in his mind. And Quran says, إِنَّهُ مِنْ عِبَادِنَا الْمُخْلَصِينَ, he was from among my most pure servants. So this is a commentary on that society and the upper levels of that society and their culture, and the materialistic culture, the materialism that was surrounded them in an advanced society, in a prosperous, wealthy society, as to what happens there. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly refers to mutrafin as the real wrongdoers. And the mutrafin are the ones who are given to luxuries and pleasures and desires and have the means to do it. And so those are the mutrafin. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even describes that when he decides to to destroy cities and communities, he raises mutrafin among them who do so. And we see signs of that in our society, this celebrity culture that we see around us, and all of that is driven by it. We should close our eyes and move as far away as possible from that culture, from being involved, from following that kind of news, from following those kind of persons. This is just absolutely not something that a Muslim with taqwa and belief in Allah should ever be doing. And also those, not only Quran describes his innocence, but those women themselves testified to his innocence at a later time, when he was being brought out of the prison, and so he said, no, I want a clarification of what happened. I want to ask those women, did I do anything wrong? And they testified at that time, no, we didn't see any hint of any wrong in him. So they themselves testified to nobleness and highness of his character at that point. And so it deals with a very important part of human psychology, human life, and very important part of where human beings go wrong in their desires. And so this is again a very important lesson that we can draw from it. The third lesson that I want to focus on is Yaqub alayhi salam and his dealing with his children, and his dealing with his pain and his grief. That his children, whom he as an elder could see what is going on, and he was afraid that what may happen, what they may do. And regardless, even then, he is dealing with them on their face value. He's taking their word for what they are describing to him. So this is something this is how we should deal with the word, because we have no way to understand what lies in another person's heart. We need to deal with on what is apparent, what is clear, and if there is something we don't know, then we have to accept the person's word for it. We have to deal with people on their face value. And so he accepted them in that sense. Second thing is the depth of his grief on losing Yusuf alayhi salam and him being lost. Depth of that his grief to the level that his tears will flow from his eyes day after day after day, not just for days, not for just months, but for years. And that flow of tears will ultimately make him go blind. And so that was the level of his grief. And yet his trust and faith in Allah, and the fact that trust and faith in Allah does not negate grief. These are two separate things. That a prophet was going through the process of grief, where he was, though no one could have greater trust and faith in Allah than he does. But grief is linked with our worldly relationships of love, the mawadda that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in our hearts. And we cannot be devoid of that love and that mawadda in our hearts. And if that mawadda is there, then grief will be there. And so grief will exist. But it is showing the depth of his grief, and then Quran also shows us the extent of his hope in that process of grief. That to the level that people feared, and he feared, that people will call him mad, that they will say he's out of his mind, that he is still thinking that there is no rational way to think that he will ever be reunited with Yusuf alayhi salam. And he keeps his hopes up. And he expects from Allah that is going to happen, despite it being a very irrational hope in the eyes of people around him. And so that was the extent of his hope. And that gives us a lesson, a model as to how we should treat the grief and hope in that. So if I want to summarize this surah as a whole, from beginning to the end is a story of two kinds of characters. One that is carnal, that is animalistic, one that is sublime, that is above human grade. And so we human beings are given both qualities. We carry qualities which are described as Bahemia, carnal, animalistic, and Malakutia, which is angelic. And we are always moving between these two, and we are always struggling between these two. What Bahemia does is it strips man of all values and makes him a servant of base animal instincts, and is a slave of his desires. And becoming slave of your desires, although the societies that fall into that trap call it liberation, sexual liberation, intellectual liberation, and all these, we are free to follow our desires. But that is Bahemia, that is actually being enslaved. And so Quran gives us example of the wife of the master, that how it made her blind to even her own self-respect, how it made her blind to go after someone whom they considered as lower as slave. And so in that sense, that is the real enslavement. And when you free yourself from those Bahemia, that base desires, that being enslaved by them, then you free yourself. And then you rise high, then you reach the sky, then you go on the path which is the path of the Malakutia. And so this is where, if you follow that path and if you perfect that path, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ascribes humans greater status than angels. Because angels had no option to do wrong, human beings have an option to do wrong. Angels are not given anything of Bahemia, and we are given Bahemia in our creation. And so to be able to fight that and still be able to do angelic things is the height of human character development. And that is the height to which Quran invites us. That is the height that we must look up to. That is the uswa that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places before us when He describes all these narrations in the Quran. So أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.